Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you to come to the session, Your Guide to Clinical Trials from Phases to Participation. I am Sofia Olmos. I am the Myotonic Dystrophy Family Registry Coordinator at the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. Today's session will run for an hour. It's going to begin with a presentation followed by a Q&A. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to our speaker, Dr. Rutkove. Dr. Rutkove is Nancy Lurie Marks Professor of Neurology, Harvard Medical School, and he serves as the chair of the Department of Neurology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. His medical research focuses on the applications of innovative clinical neurophysiological techniques for the assessment of neuromuscular disorders and muscle dysfunction with an emphasis on electrical impedance methods. Dr. Rutkove has authored over 250 publications. He has recently served as an associate editor of Annals of Neurology and has been recognized and awarded for his innovative work by different organizations like the Prize for Life Foundation and the American Association of Electrodiagnostic and Neuromuscular Medicine. He continues to focus his research on extend novel diagnostic and therapeutic approaches to improve neuromuscular health across many domains, from disease, aging, to microgravity. Now, please, let's give an applause to our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. And now I'm going to talk about clinical trials. So I'm honored to be here. I'm a researcher and a clinician, so I take care of patients with DM1 and DM2. And I also have participated in a lot of clinical trials. I don't run clinical trials, but we're involved in a clinical trial right now. And I've certainly thought a lot about it over the years as well. So the perspective you're hearing from me is my own personal perspective, but hopefully grounded in some degree of truth. So just quickly, these are my disclosures, really not relevant to anything we're talking about here today. So just to start, what do people mean by a clinical trial, right? Some people, you hear this term, and it's always hard to know exactly what it means. And it's a little tricky. It could actually have many definitions. And some people, when they talk about a clinical trial, they're really just talking about clinical research in a broad fashion. It could mean doing studies to identify measures of a disease progression. That's actually some of my own research I do, looking at new diagnostic technologies or looking at quality of life with a questionnaire or perhaps just even assessing the value of a new questionnaire. So clinical research, broadly speaking, can be a lot of different things. But if you really want to evaluate a new therapy, then you could be talking about a true clinical trial. Does a drug or new therapy work of some sort? Does it cause any harm? And are there any unexpected effects? So a clinical trial is really a very well-defined structure, both from the FDA and also from the NIH standpoint. And when we think about clinical trials, we're generally thinking we're going to test a drug to see whether it's effective in a disease. And I'll talk about what effective means a little later. So clinical trials are generally described as being in a specific phase. So you'll often hear this term phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. I'll walk through all of them. Phase 1 is the earliest. Phase 2 is a little more mature. Phase 3 is usually the big one. That's the one that's going to prove efficacy or not and potentially get FDA approval. And phase 4 is often follow-up surveillance after the drug is approved. Any new problems or other problems, any other issues that come out from it. So phase 1 are usually described as safety studies. So when we're talking about phase 1 clinical trials, the main issue in clinical trials that are going in phase 1 is the drug going to be safe? A lot of the drugs that are tested in humans have already been tested in animals and often in non-human primates before they actually make it into humans. But you never know what's going to happen when you actually give a drug for the first time to humans. Sometimes these drugs are actually given to healthy participants initially to make sure they're tolerated well. Sometimes they go directly into patients. And the question is, are there side effects? How does it distribute through the body? Is it ending up in the brain? Is it staying in the peripheral blood? Is it getting into the muscle? Those kind of very important questions. And of course, is it safe? Is it causing any rashes? Is it causing confusion? Is it causing weakness? Any unexpected side effects? And generally, these early phase 1 studies do not have a huge number of people, usually a couple dozen maybe, just to show that the drug is working across ages and in both men and women. So that's generally the goal. Now, the dirty little secret is that most drug companies are actually also looking maybe for a sign of efficacy early on. Is the drug doing something? Now, the problem is it's very hard to tell because these studies are often very short and they often involve very few people and there's no blinding. Everyone knows they're getting the drug basically. So it's hard to tell if there's an effect. Nevertheless, people may still try to get something else out of it as well. Phase 2 studies are the early question to ask, is the drug going to actually work in this condition, whatever disease it may be, including DM1? Does it relieve symptoms? Does it reverse symptoms? Or maybe does it just slow progression? And then again, there's always a safety question. We want to check how safe it is. And then often in phase 2 studies, people want to sort out, is there an effective dosage? Like, you generally want to get away with the lowest dose that you can give, but you certainly don't want to throw away a drug that might be potentially very beneficial just because you didn't move the dose up high enough. So sometimes you'll see phase 2 studies where they're looking at 2 or 3 doses along with a placebo. Now, I'm going to talk about blinding and about studies in a moment, but generally these studies are larger. They're not huge, but they're often between dozens and to a couple hundred people. They get more expensive. It's the pharmaceutical company, if that's who's putting this forward, is one to getting a good sense, is this drug going to be viable to move forward into a phase 3 study? So this is really, the phase 2 studies are critical because if there's a signal in there and they see that maybe an increasing dose has a bigger effect, that could be huge and could be a signal that the drug may really work well in a bigger study. And then you move from phase 2 to the phase 3 study. Now, these are the ones that people pay the most attention to. And they take a lot of time. If it's a pharmaceutical company going to move forward with a phase 3 study, they usually have been in discussions with the FDA for a length of time to make sure that everyone is on the same page. If this study is successful, it actually impacts what they say it's going to impact, and it doesn't have significant side effects or manageable side effects, it could lead to FDA approval and actual use by patients over the long term. So the question, is it more effective? Is it less effective or the same as a placebo? And again, these are going to be done in blinded fashion. I'll come back to that in a minute. Are there adverse effects? These studies may go on for a while, they may go on for 6 months, a year longer. There may be follow-up afterward in what's called an open label extension period. And in addition, they'll be looking at quality of life questionnaires, obviously survival. You want to make sure everyone's doing okay on it. And how might be used along with existing treatment. So these studies really depends on the disease condition. In something myotonic dystrophy, you're typically looking at probably a few hundred patients. You're not going to be looking at thousands of patients, but in more common conditions, some clinical studies have used thousands and thousands of patients, but not in a muscular dystrophy. And then the phase 4 studies are follow-up studies, which are really after the drug is approved, there's ongoing surveillance. People are looking to see if there are any unexpected effects. The drug may have only been used in a few hundred people before it gets approved, and now thousands and thousands of people are taking it across the age spectrum, both men and women, and suddenly you start seeing a subtle problem arising maybe in one specific group, maybe older adults who have underlying kidney disease. There's a kidney issue developing or something like that. So there's this long-term surveillance that goes on during a phase 4 study. Usually at this point, if something is caught, unless it's really bad, the drug isn't going to be taken off the market, but there may be some additional labeling that is added to the approval to make sure that it's being used successfully and appropriately in the right groups of people. So those are the big picture, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now I'm going to delve down a little bit into some of the other terminology. Sometimes you'll hear there are A, Bs, and Cs and Ds and all this kind of stuff. You'll hear, for example, phase 1B or phase 2A. Okay, generally no Cs or beyond, but these generally mean that they're trying to parse things out a little bit more. Like a phase 1B study is still looking predominantly at safety, but it's trying to get a little piece of efficacy in it. It's usually determined by the company producing the product. Phase 3 studies, in my experience, are usually just called phase 3 studies because it's a real clinical outcome that they're looking for to get at. So if you hear A's and B's, don't get too confused by them. They're just understanding the phase is the important 1, 2, 3, or 4. So let me introduce you to some other terminology that sometimes gets confusing, and sometimes there are multiple words that mean the same thing. So for example, blinded versus unblinded versus open label. So what does that mean? And then you'll often hear single versus double blinded. I'm going to come to all of these. Randomized and unrandomized. Open label, I mentioned that earlier. Lead-in period. Dose escalation study. So let me give you the blinded versus unblinded. If it's blinded, it means somebody doesn't know whether they're getting drug or a fake form of the drug called a placebo. And the placebo can be saline if it's an infusion. It could be a sugar pill. It could be nothing. It has to be something generally. The person getting the medication does not know what they're getting. Sometimes, depending on the journal or the company, you might hear it termed masked study or unmasked study instead of blinded, but it means the same thing. Unblinded studies are sometimes called open label studies. So open label means that everyone knows what they're getting. Okay. An open label study means they're either getting drug or they're getting nothing. And generally in open label studies, everyone just gets the drug for the most part. So now blinding can come in single versus double. So single blinded would mean that only the patient doesn't know what they're getting and the doctor knows what they're getting. That would be this situation. But most of the time, actually, the doctor doesn't know what they're getting either. And that makes it a double blinded study. So you don't see too many examples of single blinded. I'll mention it in a minute, but you really don't want the doctor to know and you don't want the patient to know, because some of the assessments, the doctor or the staff, doesn't have to be a doctor, it could be a nurse practitioner, it could be a clinical research coordinator. If any of them know what's going on, it may influence how they treat the patient, how they record things down, and all that could lead to bias, which may make the study not accurate. So you really want no one to really know what's going on. So that's blinding, unblinded, masked, unmasked, and single versus double. Randomized versus non-randomized. This is where the goal when you're organizing a study is you want everyone to be equally distributed across whether they're getting drug or placebo. Randomization is a way of making sure that happens. There's no one saying, okay, this person is 50 years old and very sick. Let's put them in the drug trial. And this person got very mild disease. Let's move them into the placebo. We don't want that. We want everyone to be mixed up. So randomization is a mechanism whereby you're basically using a random number generator or something else to put everyone into a different group. Randomization is not easy in the sense that if you just left it up to chance, you still might end up with 80% of women on the drug versus 20% of men on the drug just by luck. So what you have to do is, as you're doing randomization, you have to make sure that you're still making sure the groups are being balanced in terms of age, sex, maybe degree of disability, for example. So there's a lot of complexity to randomization, but we all have that down pretty well. So it's not a huge issue usually. Typically, first studies with a new drug are open label. And as you move into phase 2, most studies become blinded and randomized to at least some extent. And almost all phase 3 trials are almost always double blinded, randomized, and placebo controlled. You're not going to see too many biologic therapies, drug therapies, wherein the patients or somebody knows what they're getting outside of, I'll talk about that in a minute. There's somebody who knows what they're getting, but they're way in the background. Occasional exceptions where you can't blind the patient to an intervention. It's the only case where you'll see studies that are not double blinded. The most obvious one is surgical studies. It's very hard to do placebo surgery. So there's one great example of a single blinded study, and that was in the myasthenia gravis study looking at thymectomy. Patients had their thymus gland removed with myasthenia. The patients knew they had it removed, but the doctors were blinded to whether or not they were actually treated or not. So the blinding was on the doctor's side. But it's rare, and I don't think is really relevant to DM1 for sure. I think one thing that's always useful to know is, I don't know, when I first got into this, I thought this was people have been doing clinical trials since, I don't know, the time of the American Revolution or something like that. It ends up that the whole idea of clinical trials being balanced and thought out in this sort of very creative way is a relatively recent invention. It was just after World War II. This is one of the first publications, the streptomycin treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis, that actually was a real placebo-controlled double-blinded trial. So we're really talking, about getting close to 80 years now of history doing placebo-controlled trials. And honestly, the science of clinical trials continues to improve over time. The way we look at clinical trials in 2025 is different than the way we looked at them in, say, 2005. And I'm sure things will continue to be modified as we move into the next decade or two. Another term that you'll hear sometimes in clinical trials, and this is more relevant to DM1 and other disorders where there's a very slow progression, which is what's called a lead-in period. And in a lead-in period, you may say, the good news is you've enrolled, you've been successful. I'll talk about enrollment in a minute, but you're going to have to wait about 3 months before you start going on medication. And the reason we want you to wait is we want to track your change over time over the next few months. We want to get to know you better. We want to get to know the rate of progression of your condition better. Now in DM1, fortunately, it's not that rapidly progressive, right? So that's a good thing about DM1. But you can envision that if you track somebody for a year and got some little sense of deterioration over a year, and you put them on a medication, you might actually have a much better sense as to whether or not they're improving or not on the therapy. So that's one other term you'll hear. Another term you'll hear is dose escalation study. This is often in a situation where they're really not sure about the right dose to use, but they want to try to get you onto the right dose. and they're really worried about side effects. So it can get complicated, but long and short, you'll start on a lower dose. You're tolerating it well, they'll move you to a higher dose. And if you're still tolerating it well, they'll move you to a still higher dose. And you may continue out on that throughout the rest of the study. And if you're having any side effects, they may move you back down to a lower dose and let you continue at that lower dose. So dose escalation study is another concept that you'll hear. So that's a broad overview in what a clinical trial is and why we do them. Let me talk a little bit about what one can expect when entering a clinical trial and how to think about that. When you hear about a clinical trial and you get excited and you want to participate, it's always not, oh, you just come on in and we'll get you going and you're good to go. It's usually there's a whole bunch of hurdles you have to get through and gates, if you will, that will require, so for you to pass those in order to actually get into the study. So the first issue that is when somebody says, hey, I really want to be in a study. I've got this disease. I want to be treated. I want a chance of being treated. I want to help move science forward. So you'll reach out, or potentially that's how you'll get contacted. You'll reach out perhaps to a study center and say, hey, I've got DM1. I really want to participate in this study. Can I? And so if the study is going and the study center is recruiting patients, the first thing they'll want to do is a pre-screening call. So pre-screening is very vague, and pre-screening means they're just trying to get a little sense as to who you are and whether you're going to likely fit into the study. And so if somebody calls and say, got diagnosed because my child has very mild disease and I'm completely asymptomatic, but I've got a repeat of whatever, and maybe be very clear, oh, you're actually not going to qualify because you're actually not really clinically affected by the disease. That could be an outcome. Or you might say, I live 700 miles away. I live in northern Canada and it'd be hard to get, but I'm really interested in participating. That may also be a good reason to say it's not going to work. You're going to have to come too frequently. It's not going to work. So what we try to get during those pre-screening assessments, is there a good likelihood if we have this person come in, have them go through the whole actual screening visit, will they actually be enrolled? Or is it likely they'll just get rejected? So most of the time we're going to err on the side of, if there's a good chance we think they're going to come in, let's get them in and let's take a look. But this is the first piece of the process to getting enrolled into a study. The next thing, of course, is the actual enrollment visit. This is usually, things may change in the future, an in-person event where the first thing you will have been given, probably even before you come in for that visit, is the informed consent form. We want you to read the informed consent form, get to know it, get to understand the risks of the study. Every study has potential benefits, but it also has potential risks and potential expectations as to what you'll be able to do in the study. At the time of enrollment, the first thing we typically do is review in detail the informed consent form, which hopefully you've already reviewed, and answer any questions around it. Pretty straightforward. And then you sign the informed consent form. So the first thing that happens to enroll you is actually just sign that informed consent form. At that point, we will then work through whether you actually will be officially enrolled in the study. So signing the informed consent form doesn't enroll you in the study at that point. You're just still in the screening process. And there are what are called inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. And inclusion criteria are what must be true in order to be able to participate. So, for example, you're between a specific age range, you have genetically confirmed diagnosis of DM1, maybe you live within 50 miles of a clinical study center. There can be a whole bunch of inclusion criteria that you have to meet. And then the second part is the exclusion criteria. These are the things you do not want to have if you want to be in the study. And I list a few there. Usually being on another experimental treatment is a clear reason not to be in a study. We can't have you on 2 experimental drugs at one time. I give a couple other examples, but there are usually a whole host of potential exclusion criteria. In order to be successfully enrolled in the study, you really have to achieve this. You have to meet every single one of the inclusion criteria and every single one of the exclusion criteria, okay? And those exclusion criteria and inclusion criteria may also require at that screening visit to get blood work done and physical assessments done. So typically, after you sign the informed consent form, we go through the inclusion and exclusion criteria. We usually cannot check every box. We can check a few of them, but a few of them are left blank because we don't know about, say, your liver enzyme level or the number of CTG repeats that you have. So those are the things that may be sitting out there until a later date. But once all those lab results come back and we go check, this looks like you're meeting all the inclusion criteria. You have certain functional limitations that indicate you maybe have enough myotonia that you can be in the study. Those are all good things. And we say, okay, looks like you've met all the inclusion criteria. You have not met any, you've met all the exclusion criteria if you are, none of them are true, you're in the study. So at that point, that's great. Now you're officially in the study, but the next thing we have to do is actually start looking at assessing you and seeing how well you're doing. So all of these studies monitor something over time, right? Whether it's the VHOT, the hand opening test, or whether it's a strength measurement, or whether it's an enzyme level, for example, those are all important features that we want to look at in the disease. For baseline measurements, often in a lot of neuromuscular diseases, we're looking at strength, grip strength being one, or I don't have a VHOT picture in here, but that would be one. We look at a number of blood tests, and we're also going to get a questionnaire. We want to know how you're doing. We want to know how active you are, maybe a quality of life questionnaire, lots of baseline assessments. All of these things are going to be repeated again and again over time as we see whether the drug is working or not. And this could also include actually, I've got some EMG and MRI depending on the condition too, but maybe a little less relevant here. So then you get all those baseline assessments and they say, okay, you're ready to get something, either drug or placebo, who knows? And so this is where the trial randomization comes in. Are you going to get drug or placebo? Again, it's out of everyone's control. It's out of my control. It's out of the company's control. It's all just being done by some random number generator. Here you go. You're going to be on something. So either you get Smarties, which I personally love, or you get the actual drug. One of the things that's happened, it depends on the disease and the thinking around it. In the old days, 50% would get placebo, 50% would get drug. Things are changing a little bit. It depends in specific situations. We're seeing more and more studies now where they're doing more people getting drug than placebo. And that way, if people are not really sure they want to be in the study because they say 50-50 chance, I really want to deal with this, they go, 75% chance I'm going to get drug. That's more exciting. I'm willing to be in the study. So we're seeing more and more studies doing that. It really just depends. The disadvantage to doing that, it sounds like a great idea. The disadvantage is as you increase the number of people getting drug and decrease the number of people getting placebo, you end up having to increase the total number of people who need to be in the study in order to see an effect. So you can't get much. I've seen a lot of studies do 2-to-1. There are studies, studies doing 3-to-1, not in DM1, but in other diseases. So we'll have to see where that plays out. I think for the time being, the expectation should always is probably going to be equally balanced, but you'll know when you enroll or learn about the study, whether it's you're more likely to get drug or not. And then at that point, it becomes pretty routine, depending on the drug. Maybe the first therapy may be more challenging to get or not, but now you just get into a pattern of follow-up, right? So in muscular dystrophies and other neuromuscular diseases, a lot of things are slow change over time. And hopefully the drug is going to make a slow benefit over time. And so it's a matter of tracking and getting repeated data on a regular basis for some period of time. And it could be 6 months, it could be a year. At some point, most studies, just if you start going out beyond a year, it starts getting very expensive and complicated. So most studies try to keep it curtailed to about a year or so, but it depends on the condition. Some of the Alzheimer's medications that you may know about that got recently approved were 18-month studies. So that's even longer. But Alzheimer's is not super quickly progressive in most people. So there was reason behind that. And those studies involve thousands of people, talking about large studies. And then what is going to be going on during the study is monitoring for side effects. So any side effect, anything that happens during the study, we want to know about. That's called an adverse event. And adverse events are okay to have. If you trip and fall while you're walking down the street, that's actually called an adverse event. And it should be recorded somewhere in the notes in the study. But then the clinician like me is asked, is it related to the drug or not? It's an arbitrary decision. I say, and of course not. But there are some that may be, right? Somebody gets an infusion and they get a rash a day later. Yeah, that sounds like it might very well be related. So we're really interested in knowing about side effects. The company's really interested in knowing about side effects. So keeping a close eye on that's important. And that all gets reported out in the end as well. So just a little bit more clinical trials lingo that you may hear. So all trials have a data safety and monitoring board. This is really important. Okay, these are the people who are watching the data come in, and they know whether anything is going amiss. For example, if there's a side effect, I don't know, whatever the complaint is, somebody has some vague complaint. I don't know what is happening at UCSF or in Texas or in Montana. I know what's happening in Boston where I'm practicing medicine, but somebody else is watching this at a higher level. This group also has a very unique position because they're the only people who are unblinded. Some of the people on this committee actually know who's getting drug and who's not getting drug. And that's very important because you go, oh my God, everyone who's getting drug is having X side effect. we need to put a hold on this for the moment as this is evaluated further. So it's the really important thing about knowing about clinical trials. It's people are looking out for your own health and safety here. They're not just doing things willy-nilly. People are seriously concerned that there could be a problem and want to prevent it from happening. Other terms you might hear are early termination, futility, and open label extension. I'll just go through these quickly. Unblinding is, I put the toilet here. This is where you get a drug and they're trying to say you don't know whether you're on placebo or not, right? But if every time you take the drug and you take the thing and you pee and it's blue, you go, I don't think it's a sugar pill. So that would be unblinding. And so that's a challenge in any clinical trial, that people get unblinded. The patients can get unblinded. The physicians, coordinators, research assistants could all get unblinded as well. And that may influence things a little bit. Futility and early termination is one of these more frustrating things. Hopefully won't happen in DM1 studies, but it certainly can. Imagine this curve going down here represents the true progression of the disease, right? You're just gradually deteriorating over time, hopefully very slowly, but there's a general deterioration, right? Then you get put on a drug and you're getting assessment at some point, say along this, you're on a study, being put on a medication here and you're getting assessed at this point. Now, that's what placebo would do. You're on placebo, you're just getting worse. It's not, the sugar pill, unfortunately, doesn't work. Now, here's potential therapy 1. Oh, this is really good. This thing looks like it's actually making people better. Wow, that's incredible. That would be terrific. And you can imagine if you move forward, it will continue to get better. And I should also mention, imagine this is the end of the study here. This is, say, some midpoint assessment, if that makes sense. So this is end of study. This is some midpoint assessment. You look at potential therapy 1, it's doing great. You're going to keep the study going because you're going to, wow, by the time they're done, they're going to be better. Terrific. Okay. Then you get to potential therapy 2. Not as exciting as potential therapy 1, but hey, you're not getting worse. This is terrific. Let's keep it going. No question. Hopefully they'll show a big difference between what would have happened. But now imagine potential therapy 3 is something like this. Okay. And you go, oh, that's not too good. So the Data Safety Monitoring Board can actually do an assessment at that time to decide whether or not, if we continue this out and this trend continues, is this ever going to be significantly different? Is there actually going to be a statistical difference between the two groups? And at that point, if the answer is no, if this continues, it won't be, the study may be terminated due to futility. Like it's futile to continue the study. So if you hear that happen, they're just basically thinking that's going to be the end result. And there's no point in spending the money, putting people at risk, keeping hopes high when nothing is going to come from it. And so that's the third option. So futility and early termination is another term you may hear. And that would be, and so you'd early terminate the study at that point. Open label extension, very common in a lot of phase 3 trials, especially where patients are placed on a drug or placebo. One group gets drug, one gets placebo for a period of time. And then after that period of time, the study period is officially over and everyone now is placed on drug. So that's another reason that people get excited about being in a clinical trial, because even if they know they're getting placebo during the blinded phase, when the open label phase starts, everyone's going to get the medication. And this is one example looking at, this is a neuropathy disease called hereditary amyloidosis. But basically, you can see here the drug worked. That you see the drug, one group was getting drug, they improved. Another group was getting placebo, they really didn't change very much. Then everyone is given drug at that point, and the group getting placebo actually now improves because they're getting drug during the open label phase. So this is the blinded phase, open label phase. So that's another important thing. You'll often just heard it referred to as OLE. OLE means open label extension. Then, of course, announcement of results often comes many months after the study is done. So it's not often a very quick turnaround on these things too. So one has to be patient. Like, okay, I finished the study, now what? And then you're just waiting as you're in the open label extension. But trust me, companies are interested in getting this information out. The doctors want to give their drugs to patients. So there's definitely a push to make this all happen, but time does have to pass. So interpreting outcomes is also another important aspect of things. Is it a symptomatic effect? Treating myotonia, that would be a symptomatic effect. We're really good, I'm okay at treating myotonia. Actually slowing disease progression and improving strength, even better yet. Now we're talking, right? That would be really great. Symptomatic effect could be nice, but maybe not really one we get, but it still could be important. Perhaps could mean less fatigue and again, decreased myotonia, or maybe just better sleep too. But a disease modifying effect is really what we're probably really hoping for here, slowing progression, improving function long-term, and restoring healthy muscle if possible. So you can imagine over time, this is where things are going. In a real effective disease, you're really looking, a new treatment, you're really looking to improve the function, or improve the muscle health per se. So clinical trials and FDA approval. Does a successful clinical trial equal FDA approval? Sometimes and sometimes not. Strictly speaking, you need 2 phase 3 trials to demonstrate drug effect and presumably no significant adverse effects. One example of that is in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, where riluzole, which is the one drug that has really stood the test of time in that disease, although it doesn't do much. 2 large clinical trials were done to prove it worked. But it's hard to do, and for rare and hard to treat disease, 1 phase 3 trial may be sufficient from the FDA. And the FDA will tell you that, yeah, you prove this works, we're going to probably approve this medication. We can't guarantee it. The board has to meet to decide, but we all agree that 1 highly significant phase 3 trial will do the trick. Unfortunately, there's been a little bit of a slippery slope, and some bigger phase 2 trials have also seeped into that, and companies have gotten drug approval based on a successful phase 2 study. And I say perhaps that was not such a good idea. Just looking at the ALS story, some of you may know about the story with Relyvrio. There was a large article in the New England Journal about this combination therapy that slowed progression of ALS on a couple of different parameters. And there was an open label extension, which the company theorized also supported their claim that the drug worked. But then, and then the FDA actually approved it after they went back twice asking for approval. The expert committee met, and some people said it's crazy, you shouldn't approve it. And other people said, no, you should approve it. And so it got approved in the end. And then about a year and a half later, a large phase 3 study was done in Europe, and there was absolutely no effect whatsoever. So the drug, to their credit, the Amylyx, the makers of Relyvrio, pulled the drug from the market, and it's no longer available. But it was a shame because it raised a lot of people's expectations. A lot of people went on it. The company made a lot of money to do this, which is good. And they're investing in other areas now, but it wasn't really for false hope, which is unfortunate. So that's why I think a good phase 3 study is really necessary before you should move toward approval of any therapy. So who pays for clinical trials? Most large phase 2 or 3 studies are generally funded by drug companies, and obviously the investors in those drug companies. But philanthropy and government funding also does play a role. Some studies are funded by the National Institutes of Health. I'm not sure how that's changing now in our current environment. But that is said, even in the past few years, NIH has been getting out of that business a little bit because it gets very expensive and very complicated to run these trials. Generally, participants pay nothing, and participants often retrieve travel stipends and compensation for this time spent as well. Often there's something to make sure that you're not going into debt to participate. But single phase 3 trials can cost a huge amount of money. And so that's why they're undertaken so seriously and so cautiously as well. And of course, the company has a lot running on these. So who actually runs the trial? That's actually another question that often comes up. Most pharmaceutical companies don't run the trials themselves. They hire what's called a clinical research organization, or CRO, to actually do the running of the trial. And they operationalize the entire thing. They're really good at this, right? Like the pharma company's good at making drug and packaging the drug and all that kind of stuff and studying it in animals, but they don't really know how to do the trial. These organizations end up doing the trial. They find the doctors, they organize data collection, monitor for side effects, meet with a regular basis. We have a monitor, like we're in the Avidity study right now. We have a monitor coming in every few months who looks at our records, talks with us, and makes sure we're doing everything right. And we ensure everyone is closely following the rules. And they are really strict. We like to absolutely go by the rules here. So can you trust the results of the clinical trial? And so I would say they're extremely carefully monitored and policed for sure. And the biostatisticians who actually do the analysis, by the way, don't know who's on what. So you've got this data safety monitoring board who's actually keeping an eye that everything's going fine and everyone is safe. But you have another biostatistician or a group of biostatisticians who are completely blinded to the data. They have no idea whether people are on drug or placebo. They're the ones who are actually doing the assessment. So I think you could be pretty confident they come up with a strong yes answer. It's probably accurate. And then there's usually a physician researcher who's been brought into the study to actually run it and serve as the figurehead for the study. And they ultimately take full responsibility for what's published. But of course, they're trying to work with the drug company and do the right things as well. But they are independent. They're not in the pay of the drug company. They're making their own decisions as to whether or not the drug is working. And of course, as a physician myself working on a study, I'm not the PI of the Avidity study. We just do what we're told, and we try to follow the rules and try to do it accurately and not influence the data. But the results are the results. And that doesn't mean things may not have been discovered in the longer term, as I mentioned, side effects, for example, or maybe a false positive study that actually ended up not being correct. So occasionally, like the Relivrio study, if you imagine if that were a phase 3 study and actually turned out to be positive, but the drug still didn't work, you never know. Sometimes statistics can be misleading sometimes. And if you have a subtle effect, even if it's significant, it may not be that meaningful in the end. Okay, so why participate? So you may be one of the first people who were effectively treated. You help advance scientific discovery. And for healthy control, it's probably not relevant here, but usually in phase 1 studies, you may have a friend or loved one who you feel you may be able to help as well. I think depending on study and the organization, you can meet and connect with others, hopefully as you're doing here today. And then you should always look before you leap. Remember, many trials are not successful. I think we're really getting good at DM1 science now. I'm feeling confident that we're going to see more successful trials in this disease in the years to come, but some aren't. Some can be demanding in terms of time and travel. So if 200 miles didn't sound like a big deal when you enrolled, and then suddenly it's like turning into a big nuisance, that could be a problem. Or maybe you're traveling for business or what have you, and that could influence things. Side effects could be an issue. And again, some of these side effects may be slow in showing up, and that's always a concern. And of course, you should never sign up for something if you don't think you can manage it. Too many family obligations and stuff, that's always a bad probably idea to do. How to find out about ongoing clinical trials. You probably all know about clinicaltrials.gov. That's still all the go-to. Any clinical trial that's going on has to register here. So you can always go there. There's a lot of noise. Like if you go, there's a humongous number of trials, but if you look for the green ones, those are the ones that are either actively enrolling or planning to actively enroll, and you can go through them and see what's there. And there are ways of choosing if you only want to choose on active studies. So you can always keep your eye out for that. A lot of the studies are not going to be clinical therapeutic trials. They may be like checking out some new questionnaire in DM1, for example. So final thoughts. So I think it's obviously a very exciting time in myotonic dystrophy therapy. Being part of a clinical trial can mean you're one of the first people to get a new treatment, means you can help advance science, but it comes with responsibilities and expectations. And I will just say, as a physician, nothing is more painful to me when someone says, I got to drop out of the study. It's just too much time and I don't have the time to participate. You're like, oh my God, we worked so hard to get you in this. Please don't. So I think everyone wants to try to get somebody to the end of the study if we can. But just because you want to participate doesn't mean you'll be able to, based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And finally, one of the really important points I want to end with here is it's always okay to pull out of the study. I just made a comment, please don't, but actually you should. If you feel uncomfortable, if you feel the drug is not making you feel well, it's making your life miserable for whatever reason, even though you sign a consent form, you are able to withdraw consent at any time. And you should always feel free to do that. In the end, we're interested in making you better, not just advancing science too. So we have to look out for your health. So I will end there. Happy to answer any questions. Mice and primates. Sure. I'll be honest with you, I have a lot less experience with primates, but mouse studies usually are the earliest in animal studies that we typically do. There are many different mouse models for different diseases. And in DM1, there's an ever expanding number of different mouse models. In the mouse models, we attempt to replicate the human disease, which is not so straightforward in myotonic dystrophy because the human disease is complex, to say the least. But the mouse models are used often to look for early evidence of drug effect. And in the mice, we can do all sorts of nasty things to them that we don't do to people, like put them to sleep, euthanize them, and then look at their tissues, look at histology, look at how the brain or the muscle or the heart is being impacted by the drug. We can also do functional tests on them and look at also molecular aspects. Is the splicing abnormalities in that are part of the RNA abnormalities, splicing abnormalities that are part and parcel for DM1 being corrected or not? Even primate studies are usually obviously much more complicated and much more expensive. And we don't want to do a lot of those if we can avoid it. So those are usually looking at, is the drug getting to where we need it to get in primates? Is it effectively working in primates? Obviously, primates are close relatives, and it's showing efficacy and safety there. It's reassuring that when it goes into humans, it's going to be acceptable for humans as well.
Just a question on a trial that you get into. If you're in a trial and starts and you are on the drug, not the placebo, and it goes to futility, doesn't go through, would that ever preclude you from getting a drug that makes it through phase 3 and is approved and is available to the masses.
So if you're in a study that is called ends early because
Yeah.
due to futility, does that stop you from getting into another study, you mean?
Or taking a drug eventually years down the road.
No, not at all. No. Typically, the only issue with drug studies is they don't want you on two investigational products at the same time. That's a no-no. So as drugs get approved, so if one of the drugs that are currently in trials now get approved and you're on it, and then 5 years from now, there's another great drug that would be safe to take in addition, it's possible you could remain on that one drug and then take a second drug. That's happened, for example, in ALS, again, as a great example, where almost all ALS patients now are expected to be on riluzole, and then they get another drug added on to it. So yeah, there's nothing precluding additional continuation in a study.
When we read that this potential solution gets an orphan drug classification and breakthrough, how does that affect in terms of positive advancement or FDA help or whatever?
Yeah, so the Orphan Drug Act, the goal of that was it's complicated, and I don't know all the details. Part of the goal was to get pharmaceutical companies interested in rare diseases. So that's one of the reasons that act passed in the first place, because otherwise all you'd ever want to try to create drugs for is like heart disease and maybe various forms of cancer. Not all very important things, but obviously you wouldn't be focusing on rarer diseases like DM1. So that's one aspect. So it helps guarantee, and if anyone knows this better than I do, feel free to speak up. It guarantees some level of protection for many years. Like riluzole, again, the ALS is a good analogy. That drug is still under protection by one company, that's Sanofi, which is the one company producing it. So it's good from the company to advance it. From an approval standpoint, I believe what it does is it allows approval with just a single phase 3 study. But again, I don't want to if anyone knows better about that, please speak up. But it does simplify the approval process a little bit because they know it's hard to do big clinical trials in that disease.
I have a question about a phase 1.
Mhm.
Does that mean they're doing safety and efficacy? And is it faster? Is it accelerated? Or
Yeah, so there are sometimes they'll talk about seamless studies. It sounds like some kind of new clothing or something like that. But where you're blending the phases, like you'll go right from a phase 2 to a phase 3. I think that's fallen a little out of favor. But the phase 1 and phase 2 is, we're going to say we have one trial design because we want to save some money. We can do it all at once. One trial design focusing initially on phase 1 safety. And if all the boxes get checked, we'll move you automatically into a phase 2. Now, I don't know, depending on the details of that, may be an open label phase 2, or maybe it's a blinded phase 2. Everyone was getting drug initially in phase 1 and they move into phase 2. Maybe they introduce a placebo group, but it would just basically be combining them both into a single study for cost and efficiency reasons. You still have to get through the phase 1 safety issues.
So thank you very much. This
Okay,
was
thank you
great.
all.
Thanks.